That morning in the Valley of Ain Jalut, everything was quiet. The Mongol army was confident, a certainty built across centuries, a faith so deep it had stopped feeling like faith and started feeling like fact. But no one noticed the silence sitting in the hills above them. Not the silence of peace, the silence of something waiting. Sultan Qutuz and Baybars had seen a truth before anyone else had dared to look at it directly. The Mongols cannot be broken on open ground. So what they needed to give them was not a battlefield, it was a prison. And in that moment, the impossible plan that would bend the course of history snapped into motion. An empire about to be struck with its own weapon, and the sound of unshod hooves beginning to crack against stone. How did Baybars build this trap of pure intelligence? How did the very thing that made the Mongols unstoppable become the thing that destroyed them inside this valley? We're going to follow the footprints of the moment the Mongol storm drowned in a swamp. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Do you think this was a victory of strategy or the inevitable consequence of geography? Let's meet in the comments. September 3rd, 1260, dawn. The Valley of Ain Jalut stretched out narrow and still in the early light of a Palestinian morning. To the north, the limestone ridges rose sharp and dark, their faces already warmed by the climbing sun. To the south, the spring, the one that gave this place its name, the Spring of Goliath, seeped quietly through the rock and softened the ground in ways that were invisible from a distance. The air smelled of dry brush and morning cold. It would not stay cold for long. At the mouth of the valley, a rider pulled his horse to a halt and looked back at the men behind him. There were perhaps a few hundred of them, no more. A thin line of Mamluk cavalry stretched across the valley entrance, horses shifting, armor catching the early light in brief flashes. They looked, to anyone watching from a distance, like exactly what Baybars needed them to look like. Small, exposed, a vanguard that had ridden too far ahead of its army, a temptation dressed up as a mistake. Baybars al-Bundukdari did not look like a man who was afraid. He looked like a man running very precise calculations behind eyes that gave nothing away. He was not yet 40. He had been taken from the Kipchak steppe as a boy, sold into the Mamluk system, trained until the training became bone, elevated by ability into command. He had studied the Mongols the way a physician studies a disease, not with fear, but with the specific cold curiosity of someone who intends to find the weakness hiding inside the strength. And he had found it.
"They are coming," said the rider beside him. Oktai, one of his senior cavalry commanders, had ridden up from the rear of the thin line. His voice was even. He had been told what was expected of him today, and he had not flinched. "The column is moving. 2, perhaps 3 kilometers back. They will see us within the hour." Baybars nodded once. "Then we let them see us." He turned his horse back toward the valley entrance and looked at his men. These were not ordinary soldiers. Every man in this vanguard had been selected, not for bravery, which was common, but for discipline, which was not. What Baybars needed today was not courage. Courage was easy. What he needed was the ability to run in the exact direction he told them to run, at the exact moment he told them to run, and to make it look like terror. "You know what you are," he said, loud enough to carry down the line. "You are the bait. You are the hook. And when I give the word, you will be the most convincingly frightened cavalry this valley has ever seen. Not before, not after, when I give the word." A murmur moved through the line, not protest, acknowledgement. These men understood what was being asked of them, and they understood why it would work. Because it was the Mongol tactic. The feigned retreat, the telugma, was the instrument that had broken Polish knights at Legnica, Hungarian cavalry at Mohi, army after army that had known it was coming and still could not stop themselves from following. Baybars had not invented it. He had simply decided that the people who had built the weapon should be the ones to have it used against them. The Mongol column appeared at the valley mouth as the sun climbed toward mid-morning. They came in formation, compact, disciplined, the sound of their approach building from a low vibration in the ground to the full percussion of thousands of hooves on stone and packed earth. At their head, the Mongol forward units fanned into screening positions. Their eyes moved across the terrain with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this on 100 different landscapes. And then they saw the Mamluk vanguard. A thin line, a few hundred riders, holding the valley entrance with what looked like nervous uncertainty, horses not quite still, commanders visible conferring with each other in the manner of men deciding whether to fight or run. Baybars watched the Mongol forward scouts. He watched their posture change. He had spent years learning to read Mongol cavalry the way other men read text, and what he read now in the way their horses quickened, the way the scouts turned back to the column with new energy, was exactly what he had expected to see. They thought they had found easy prey. Good.
The first arrows came fast, Mongol composite bows releasing at range with the flat, efficient crack that Baybars had heard before and that still sent something cold through the chest. Several landed short, a few struck shields. One of his men's horses screamed and lurched sideways. Baybars did not move. He waited 3 more heartbeats. Then he raised his arm and dropped it. What happened next was rehearsed, and the rehearsal had been brutal. Every man in the vanguard had practiced this exact movement until it lived in the muscles rather than the mind. The line broke, not cleanly. Cleanly would look like a withdrawal, and a withdrawal could be ignored. It broke the way a line breaks when fear wins, which is to say, loudly, unevenly, with men pulling their horses hard and shouting at each other, and the whole formation coming apart in the specific scattered chaos that the Mongol eye had been trained across generations to recognize as the beginning of a rout. They ran into the valley. The horses drove hard, hooves throwing up the dry, pale dust of the valley floor in great rolling clouds that rose and spread and thickened behind them as they moved deeper into the corridor. This was not accidental. The riders at the rear of the retreating vanguard angled their horses in sweeping arcs, deliberately churning the ground, deliberately thickening the dust wall that billowed back toward the Mongol forward units. Within moments, the air behind the retreating Mamluks was a pale fog. The limestone walls on both sides trapped it, held it, kept it from dispersing in the way it would have on open ground. The Mongols at the front of the pursuit column rode into that fog and lost their sight lines. They could see the shapes of fleeing riders ahead. They could not see what lay beyond them. Baybars, riding at the controlled center of the retreat, knew exactly what lay beyond them. He had ridden this valley in the dark. He had walked its floor on foot, pressed his hands into the soft ground near the spring, studied the angles of the ridgelines above. He knew where the ground would betray a heavy horse. He knew where the limestone sheltered men who had been lying motionless since before sunrise. He knew where the walls were. The dust thickened behind him as the vanguard drove deeper into the corridor. The sound of Mongol pursuit grew louder, the specific percussion of a force that has smelled blood and stopped calculating. Baybars did not look back. Looking back was not part of what today required. Today required him to ride and to trust the intelligence of a plan that had been built on months of preparation and one essential truth about the army chasing him. They had never been the ones running into someone else's trap before. They did not know what that felt like. They were about to find out. The dust rose, the walls narrowed, the valley deepened around them like something closing its hand. And in the hills above, in the shadows of the limestone and the dry brush, where 10,000 Mamluk cavalry had been still since before the sun came up, the waiting continued. Not for much longer.
The dust that Baybars left behind him did not simply obscure the valley, it invited. There is a particular quality to a dust cloud raised by fleeing cavalry.
It moves differently from the dust of an advancing force. It billows backward, away from the riders, shaped by the speed of flight rather than the deliberate weight of advance. Any Mongol commander worth his rank knew the difference. Any Mongol commander worth his rank had seen it 100 times, on the steppes of Central Asia, on the plains of Persia, in the streets of cities that no longer existed. Fleeing cavalry raised that specific kind of dust, and fleeing cavalry meant one thing: an enemy breaking. Kitbuka Noyan read the cloud the way he had been trained to read it since boyhood, and what he read confirmed everything he already believed about the day. He was 50 years old, or near it, a Nestorian Christian from the Naiman tribe, elevated through decades of campaign and conquest to the command of the Mongol forces in the Levant. He had served Hulagu Khan faithfully through the destruction of the assassin strongholds in Persia, through the siege and sack of Baghdad in 1258, through the fall of Damascus. He had watched cities that had stood for centuries cease to exist within days. He had seen armies 3 times the size of anything the Mamluks could field dissolved before Mongol cavalry like salt in water. He had been present at moments that rewrote the geography of the known world. Kitbuka Noyan had never lost a battle. Not once, not in 70 years of Mongol expansion that had swept from the Pacific coast to the edge of Europe. Not the Poles at Legnica, not the Hungarians at Mohi, not the Seljuks, the Abbasids, the Georgians, the Armenians. The Mongol record in open battle was not a streak, it was an identity. It was the foundational fact on which everything else was built. You could disagree with the Mongols about territory, about tribute, about the terms of surrender. You could not disagree with them about who won when armies met in the field. This was the architecture of the mind that looked at Baybar's dust cloud and saw not a trap, but a gift. "They break," said his second commander, Toku, riding up beside him. He was younger than Kitbuka by 15 years, and there was something bright and hungry in the way he watched the fleeing Mamluks. "Their vanguard cannot hold, they run." Kitbuka looked at the valley entrance. The dust was thick now, pale and churning in the morning air, funneled by the limestone walls on both sides into a long rolling column that rose above the corridor. The shapes of the retreating riders had already disappeared into it. From where he sat, the valley looked like a throat swallowing something. A colder mind might have paused at that image. Kitbuka did not pause. "How many were at the entrance?" he asked. "Scouts counted perhaps 300, perhaps 4, no more." 300 against a Mongol column of 10 to 12,000. The arithmetic was so lopsided it stopped being arithmetic and became something more like confirmation. This was exactly what every engagement in the Levant had looked like from the Mongol side. A defender with insufficient force, insufficient nerve, insufficient understanding of what they were facing. They always broke, they always ran. The only variable was how far they ran before the cavalry caught them. "Send 2,000 forward," Kitbuka said. "Full pursuit. I want the valley cleared before noon." Toku hesitated. 1 heartbeat. 2. Kitbuka felt it. "Speak." "The valley, Commander. It narrows. Our scouts have not ridden its length." Kitbuka turned to look at him, not with anger, with the specific patience of a man who has had this conversation before, in different forms, in different languages, across a decade of campaigns. The patience of someone explaining the obvious to someone who should already know it. "The Mamluks rode its length," he said. "If the ground could not hold them, it cannot hold us. If the ground holds us, their numbers do not matter. We are 10,000, they were 300. He looked back at the valley entrance. "Send the forward units in, full speed. I want them caught before they reach their main force." Toku said nothing more. The order went down the line. 2,000 Mongol cavalry peeled away from the column and drove into the valley entrance at the gallop. The sound was enormous, the massed percussion of horses accelerating on hard ground, armor moving, weapons rattling in their mounts, the low, continuous thunder of a force that had done this before and knew exactly how it ended. The dust cloud ahead of them thickened as they entered the corridor, their own movement adding to what Baybars' retreat had already built, and within moments the valley was a roaring pale fog, with the shapes of riders moving through it like shadows. The pursuit had begun. And then a thing happened that no one in Kitbuka's staff acknowledged, because no one in Kitbuka's staff had been trained to see it as a problem. The valley narrowed. Not dramatically, not immediately. It happened gradually, the way a river narrows as it moves toward its source, the walls growing closer by degrees, the floor contracting from the width that had allowed the initial entry into something measurably tighter. The 2,000 forward cavalry, riding hard in pursuit of Baybars' retreating vanguard, felt the compression as a physical sensation. Horses that had entered the corridor with room to spread began to press against their neighbors. Riders who had been able to see a clear line of advance now found that line interrupted by the flanks of adjacent horses. The formation, that precise, breathing, living instrument of Mongol military doctrine, began to change shape without anyone ordering it to change shape. It stretched.
The fastest horses moved ahead. The slower ones fell back. The units that had entered together began to string out along the valley floor into a line rather than a mass, the front of the pursuit moving deeper into the corridor while the rear units were still entering from the valley mouth. What had been a concentrated force was becoming an elongated column, and an elongated column is a different thing from a concentrated force. It is a series of separate problems rather than a single solution. No messenger rode back to Kitbuka to report this, because from inside the pursuit it did not feel like a problem. It felt like speed. It felt like the gap closing between the forward riders and the fleeing Mamluks. It felt, to the men riding in it, exactly the way a successful pursuit always felt. Urgent, forward, almost finished. Behind them, at the valley mouth, Kitbuka watched the last of his forward units enter the corridor. The main body of his force pressed behind them, horses bunching at the narrowing entrance the way water bunches at a bottleneck. His commanders looked to him. He gave the order to advance. The entire column moved into the valley. This is the moment that requires a particular quality of attention to see clearly, because from the outside it looked like momentum. It looked like an army doing what armies are supposed to do, driving forward, pressing advantage, refusing to allow a broken enemy to regroup and return. Every lesson the Mongol military tradition had ever taught pointed toward this movement. Pursue, accelerate, never allow a retreating enemy to choose the terms of the next engagement. Every lesson, every time, for 70 years. But underneath the valley floor, in places where the spring water from Ain Jalut had been seeping through fractured limestone for centuries, the ground was not what it appeared. The surface held, the substrate did not. And in the narrowing corridor, with 10,000 horses compressing into a space that had been designed by geography, by season, by the man who had chosen this ground to hold them, the physical world was already beginning to arrange its own opinion of the Mongol record in open battle. Kitbuka entered the valley last, as a commander should. He looked ahead at the corridor stretching before him, at the walls rising on both sides, at the dust that had not settled and would not settle, at the shapes of his cavalry moving deeper into the valley in a long, attenuated line that was no longer quite the force he had ordered into the entrance. Something moved in the back of his mind. Not fear. He did not have the habit of fear. Something smaller than fear. A question that arrived too late and left too quickly to be fully formed. He did not look up at the ridgelines. The valley received him. and above him, in the brush and shadow of the limestone heights where 10,000 Mamluk cavalry had been motionless since before dawn, the waiting continued, patient, absolute, the held breath of a trap that had already closed on one end and was waiting for the signal to close on the other. The signal would not be long now.
But first, the valley had its own work to do. There is a word in the language of water, not a spoken word, a physical one. The word a river speaks when it leaves wide country and enters narrow rock. The current does not slow, it compresses, it accelerates, it loses the ability to spread sideways and converts that lost freedom into something more dangerous moving forward. The water does not know it is being shaped, it simply moves the way water moves, following the path that gravity and geography have agreed upon. 10,000 Mongol cavalry were that water now. They did not know it yet. The walls of Ain Jalut had been patient for longer than any army had existed. Limestone formed over millions of years, fractured by water and time into the specific shapes that now rose on both sides of the corridor. Not sheer cliffs, but steep enough, rocky enough, thick enough with dry brush and shadow to make a climbing horse a problem and a climbing army an impossibility. The valley floor ran between them like a sentence narrowing toward its final word. The Mongol forward cavalry felt the walls before they saw them close. It began as a sensation. A rider on open steppe exists in a particular relationship with space. Space to the left, space to the right, the horizon in every direction, the constant peripheral awareness of room to move. That awareness does not announce itself. It simply lives in the body, in the steady, unconscious knowledge that if the rider to your left makes a bad decision, you can angle away from him, that if a threat appears at your flank, there is ground to use against it. The steppe is infinite. The steppe always has another option. The valley was not offering options. The walls had been 300 meters apart at the entrance, then 250, then 200. The change was gradual enough that no single moment felt like alarm, which is exactly how gradual changes become catastrophes. Not in one terrible instant, but in a long series of unremarkable ones, each slightly worse than the last, none quite bad enough to force a decision. A Mongol cavalry commander named Chagan rode near the front of the pursuit column. He was 32 years old, a veteran of the Persia campaign, a man who had grown up on horses and trusted them the way other men trust solid ground. He had been riding for 20 minutes inside the valley when he first felt it, not a thought, not an observation, but a physical tightening. His horse pressed against the rider to his right. He corrected. A moment later, it happened again. He looked left. The wall was close, closer than it had been. He looked right. The wall was close there, too. He looked ahead at the dust and the retreating shapes of the Mamluk vanguard, still visible, still moving, still apparently within reach, and he made the calculation that the pursuit logic demanded. Still running, still catchable, still almost finished. He pressed his horse forward. This is what a trap feels like from the inside. Not like a trap, like almost. The Mongol forward cavalry saw them stop. This moment deserves to be held for a breath because it contains the entire architecture of what Baybars had built. The pursuit force had been riding for 20 minutes in the specific psychological state that a successful chase produces, forward-leaning, accelerating, the mind already past the fight and into the aftermath. The retreating enemy had been a problem solving itself, shrinking with every stride. And then the problem stopped moving. The forward Mongol riders pulled up instinctively. The riders behind them did not. The riders behind them could not see what had stopped the riders ahead. They were riding through dust, through the compressed space of a valley that had been narrowing for 20 minutes, through the noise of thousands of hooves on stone. They knew the riders ahead had slowed because they felt the compression, the sudden bunching, horse against horse, the jolt of forward momentum meeting unexpected resistance. They pulled their own horses up. The riders behind them had the same problem. The valley floor filled. In the open steppe, a cavalry force that stops has options: spread left, spread right, turn, reform, use the infinite horizontal space that the steppe provides to convert a stopped mass back into a moving formation. The steppe gives armies the ability to think with their bodies, to solve problems through movement. The valley gave them a corridor 200 meters wide and walls that did not negotiate. The forward units pressed against the stopped horses ahead of them. The middle units pressed against the forward units. The rear units, still entering the valley from the mouth 2 kilometers back, could not see any of this. They could see dust, they could hear noise, they could feel the slowing of the column ahead in the way water feels a dam before it sees one. And they kept moving because the column had been moving, and stopping was not the order that had been given. 10,000 horses in a 200-meter corridor. The noise became extraordinary. Not the noise of battle, not yet, but the specific compressed noise of an enormous force that has lost its geometry. Horses kicking at neighbors, commanders shouting orders that the walls threw back at them in useless echoes. Unit commanders trying to create the lateral space that the terrain was categorically refusing to provide. The precision that had carried Mongol armies from the Pacific to the edge of Europe, that living, breathing, responsive formation that functioned like a single organism, began to seize. The flanking maneuver that was the Mongol answer to every tactical problem required room to the left and room to the right. There was no room to the left. There was no room to the right. There was only the valley floor, soft in places where the spring water had been patient, hard in places where the limestone surfaced, and the walls above that had been building to this moment for millions of years without hurry. Chagan, near the front of the stalled column, turned his horse in a tight circle and looked at the walls and looked at the men packed behind him and looked at the Mamluk vanguard sitting motionless across the narrowest point of the valley and felt, for the first time in his career, the specific texture of a mistake that cannot be undone. He opened his mouth to shout a warning to the men behind him. He never completed it, because above the ridgelines, above the brush and the limestone shadows and the long patience of 10,000 men who had been still since before the sun, Baybars had chosen the stopping point weeks before the battle. He had ridden the valley alone, or nearly alone, in the gray pre-dawn hours when the ground showed its true face and the limestone walls above held their silence and the spring water made its quiet argument with the soil. He had walked his horse slowly through the corridor, reading the ground the way he had been taught to read terrain in the Mamluk training barracks of Cairo, not as scenery, but as a set of tactical facts, each one either a problem or a resource depending on which side of it you were standing on. He found the place where the valley curved. It was not a dramatic curve. From a distance, from the perspective of a pursuing cavalry force riding hard through dust and noise, it might have looked like almost nothing, a slight bend in the corridor, the walls angling inward just a few degrees. But those few degrees changed everything. A straight valley offered the pursuer a constant sight line, the ability to see the ground ahead and adjust. A curved valley broke that sight line. At the apex of the curve, the floor ahead became invisible. The walls beyond the bend hid whatever was waiting there. And the ground at the apex was soft, not visibly, not in a way that would announce itself to a rider moving fast, but Baybars had pressed his hand into the soil there, had felt the moisture that the spring water left in the fractured limestone beneath, had understood what 900 kilograms of horse and armored rider would do to that surface when 10,000 of them compressed into this narrow space. He had marked the place in his memory, and he had not forgotten it. Now, riding at the controlled center of the retreating vanguard, he watched the curve of the valley wall appear ahead of him, and he did the thing he had rehearsed. He stopped. Not dramatically, he did not raise a sword or shout a command. He simply brought his horse from a gallop to a canter to a halt, turning the animal sideways across the valley floor, and the riders nearest him did the same, the rehearsed stillness spreading outward through the vanguard like a wave moving backward, each man checking his horse as the signal reached him, the whole retreating line converting from flight to formation in the time it took the dust to settle around them. The Mamluk vanguard stood across the narrowest point of the valley and faced back the way they had come.
The silence ended the way a held breath ends, all at once, with everything. No trumpet, no single voice giving a command that traveled down a chain of subordinates, no gradual build from quiet to loud. One moment the ridgelines above Ain Jalut were what they had been since before sunrise, still, dark, apparently empty, the brush and limestone holding their shapes against the morning sky with the absolute passivity of geography. The next moment, they were not. The next moment, they were alive with something that had been there all along, waiting with a patience so complete it had become indistinguishable from absence. Sultan Qutuz had chosen the word himself, not a horn signal, not a flag, a word that every man on those ridgelines had been told to listen for, passed mouth to ear in the last darkness before dawn when the army was taking its positions, a word that would travel fast enough through 10,000 men to make what came next feel like a single movement rather than 10,000 separate decisions. The word came, and the hills came down. Mamluk cavalryman Mahmud ibn Yusuf had been on the eastern ridgeline since the 4th hour before dawn. He was 26 years old, originally from the Circassian coast, trained in the Cairo barracks for 7 years before earning his place in the main army. He had fought 3 engagements before today, none of them anything like today. He had lain in the brush of the ridgeline for 4 hours with his horse's muzzle wrapped in cloth, his armor dulled with dust so it would not catch light, his body absolutely still, watching through gaps in the limestone as the valley below him filled with the enemy. He had watched the Mongol column enter. He had watched it compress. He had watched the forward units stall at the curve where Baybars had stopped, and the rear units press blindly against them from behind. He had watched 10,000 men and horses pack themselves into a corridor with no room to think, and he had felt, with the clarity that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to people who had not been there, the exact moment the geometry of the battle became irreversible. Then the word came. He did not think. The body that 7 years of Mamluk training had built moved without consulting the mind that lived inside it. He was on his horse. His horse was moving. The ridgeline was falling away beneath him as the animal drove down the slope with the momentum of the high ground behind it. And around him on both sides the same thing was happening. Man after man, horse after horse, the entire eastern ridgeline converting from stillness to avalanche in a single continuous motion that had no beginning and no end, only the gathering of its own weight. He heard his own voice. He did not recognize it. It was the voice of something older than language, something that lived beneath the training and the strategy and the careful, cold intelligence of the plan. Raw sound, pure volume, the war cry that 10,000 men release when 4 hours of silence finally, violently ends. The noise hit the valley floor before the riders did.
Inside the compressed mass of Mongol cavalry, the sound arrived as a physical event. Chagan heard it first as vibration, not in his ears, but in his chest, in the sternum, the specific deep resonance of many thousands of voices producing sound simultaneously. He had opened his mouth to shout a warning to the men behind him. The warning became irrelevant before he could complete it. He looked up at the eastern ridgeline. The ridge was falling. That was the only word for it. The shape of the ridgeline itself appeared to be coming apart. The static line of brush and rock that had been the horizon above the valley floor dissolving into movement, into a cascade of horses and men and noise pouring downward at an angle that turned gravity into a weapon. The sunlight caught armor. The sound grew past the threshold where individual voices could be distinguished and became a continuous roar that the limestone walls on both sides of the valley took and amplified and threw back at the men standing in the corridor below. He turned west. The western ridgeline was doing the same thing. Both walls, simultaneously, falling. The horses around Chagan felt it before the riders did, the ears going flat, the bodies tightening, the ancient prey animal recognition of a threat arriving from above and on both sides at once, with no cover and no exit. 3 horses reared in the same moment. A 4th turned in a tight circle, its rider fighting the reins. The compression that had already stolen the formation's geometry now acquired a new and terrible quality. 10,000 horses in a 200-meter corridor, and the horses were beginning to be afraid. Chagan did what a commander does. He turned to give an order. He could not hear himself speak. Sultan Qutuz came off the western ridgeline in the 3rd rank of the descent, which was where a sultan should have been, behind the forward shock element, positioned to direct rather than lead, insulated from the chaos of the first contact by the bodies of men whose job was to absorb it. He did not stay in the 3rd rank. This is the kind of decision that gets made in the body rather than the mind. Qutuz was 43 years old, a former slave like Baybars, a man who had survived the Mongol destruction of his homeland and risen through the Mamluk system by the same combination of ability and ferocity that the system was designed to cultivate. He had planned this battle for months. He had placed every unit, chosen every position, timed every movement with the precision of a man who understood that against the Mongols there was no margin for error and no second attempt. He had also spent 43 years learning what it felt like when the plan met the reality, and the reality required something the plan had not accounted for. As he came down the western slope, he could see the valley floor below him, the compressed mass of Mongol cavalry, the dust, the beginning of the panic that the simultaneous descent from both ridgelines was producing, the rear units still pushing forward from the valley mouth into a space that could not receive them. And he could see Baybars' vanguard, turned and waiting at the narrow curve, the front of the U that would complete the encirclement. The geometry was right, the mathematics was right. 10,000 Mongol cavalry in a corridor, with enemies above them on both sides, and an armed wall ahead of them, and 2 kilometers of their own confused column blocking the only exit. The geometry was right.
But geometry is not enough. Geometry is a fact. What converts a fact into a victory is the willingness of men to move toward something terrible rather than away from it. And willingness lives in the chest, not on the map. Qutuz had seen enough battles to know that the next 60 seconds would determine whether the plan held or whether the human material it depended on would do what human material always wanted to do, which was survive. He drove his horse to the front of the descent. The men nearest him saw where he was going and followed, not because they were ordered to, because a sultan at the front of a charge produces something in the men behind him that no order can produce. The specific shame of being anywhere else, the specific clarity that if he can go there, so can you. The descent accelerated around Qutuz as he drove down the final slope and onto the valley floor, and the Mamluk cavalry that came with him hit the western flank of the Mongol mass with the full weight of elevation and momentum, and the particular violence of men who had been still for 4 hours and were no longer still. The sound of the impact was unlike anything Chagan had ever heard. Iron against iron at scale, in an enclosed space. Not the individual clangs of a skirmish, but a continuous hammering, the accumulated collisions of thousands of simultaneous contacts, the valley walls taking that sound and compressing it and returning it louder than it arrived. Men shouted, horses screamed. The dust that Baybars' retreat had raised and the Mongol pursuit had thickened was now joined by the dust of the descent from both ridgelines, and the valley floor became a gray rolling fog through which shapes moved and collided, and the noise was total, and the noise was everything. From the eastern slope, Mahmud ibn Yusuf hit the valley floor and drove his horse into the mass of Mongol cavalry to his left. A Mongol rider turned to face him. The man was good, fast, controlled, his horse responding despite the chaos. They exchanged 2 blows. The third ended it. Mahmud drove forward. There was another rider, then another. The valley had become a room with walls on every side, and inside the room there was no longer any direction that did not contain a Mamluk. Ahead of the compressed mass, Baybars held his line across the curve of the valley. Behind the compressed mass, the valley mouth, 2 kilometers back, offered the only exit, and the valley mouth was filled with Mongol rear units pressing forward, still following an order that had been given 20 minutes ago, into a situation that no longer resembled the situation the order had been designed for. The U was closed. Left, the eastern descent, Mamluk cavalry pressing in. Right, the western descent, Qutuz himself at the front, pressing in. Ahead, Baybars' vanguard, turned, armed, and waiting. Behind, their own army, blind and still moving forward. This is what a trap feels like from the inside when it is finished. Not like a trap, like a room with no doors. Like the specific and total absence of the thing that the Mongol military mind was built on. Not courage, not speed, not ferocity, but space. The steppe had always given them space. The steppe had always offered the next direction, the flanking angle, the escape route that converted a bad position into a different position. The steppe was 10,000 kilometers away. Here there was only the valley, and the valley had made its decision.
But the valley was not finished speaking. What Qutuz had built with positioning and Baybars had built with deception was a prison. A prison holds. A prison denies movement, denies options, denies the specific freedom that an army like the Mongols converted into victory on every field they had ever walked across. The encirclement was real, and it was working. The Mongol mass compressed between the ridgeline descents and Baybars' wall at the curve. The rear units still pushing blindly forward from the valley mouth. The whole enormous force grinding against itself in a space that refused to accommodate it. But a prison is passive. A prison waits. What came next was not passive. The Mamluk commanders on the eastern ridgeline had carried the devices up before dawn, wrapped in cloth, handled with the specific careful silence of men transporting something that did not forgive mistakes. There were perhaps a dozen of them positioned along the high ground, short iron tubes, dense and heavy, packed with a composition of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur that the Islamic world had been refining for decades, loaded with projectiles and braced against the rock. The Midfa. The word meant simply thrower. What it threw was less important than what it announced. The order to fire came from a commander whose name the chronicles do not record, at a moment he judged to be the peak of the encirclement's compression.
The instant when the maximum number of Mongol horses were packed into the minimum available space, when the chaos of the descent from both ridgelines had already begun to disorder the formation, but had not yet produced the kind of desperate, focused resistance that a force can generate when it understands exactly what it is fighting. The moment between confusion and decision. The moment when something new and incomprehensible could do the most damage. The first Midfa fired. Chagan felt it before he heard it. A pressure wave, low and physical, moving through the air and through the ground simultaneously, felt in the chest, in the jaw, in the bones of the hands gripping the reins. Then the sound arrived, and the sound was nothing like anything the valley had produced so far. Not iron against iron, not the human voice at scale, not the percussion of hooves on stone. This was a different register entirely, a deep concussive detonation that the limestone walls seized and compressed and threw back amplified, a sound that did not echo so much as multiply, arriving from multiple directions at once because the valley itself had become its instrument. Then the smoke. Thick, acrid, gray-white, pouring from the firing position on the eastern ridgeline and rolling downward into the valley on the morning air. Not the clean dust of cavalry movement, but something chemical, something that carried a smell that had no name in the vocabulary of men who had spent their lives on the Central Asian steppe. Sulfur, charcoal, the specific burnt metal odor of a reaction that the natural world did not produce. A second device fired, then a third. The detonations came at irregular intervals, each one landing in a slightly different part of the compressed mass below, each one adding its smoke to the growing cloud that the valley walls were trapping and concentrating the way they had trapped and concentrated everything else, the dust, the noise, the army itself. Here is what the chronicles record, and what anyone who has spent time with horses already knows. A horse can be trained for many things. A war horse, a Mongol war horse specifically, an animal that had been bred and conditioned across generations for exactly this environment, had been trained for the sound of bowstrings, for the smell of blood, for the press of bodies on all sides, for the noise of men in combat at close range. Mongol cavalry horses were among the most battle-hardened animals in the world. They had been desensitized methodically and repeatedly to every stimulus that the training tradition had identified as a threat to composure. The training tradition had not identified this, because this had not existed. The first detonation hit the horses the way the first lightning strike hits an open field, not as something to be processed and responded to, but as something that bypassed processing entirely and went directly to the oldest part of the animal brain, the part that predates training and domestication and the 10,000-year relationship between horses and the humans who ride them. The part that knows, with a certainty that no amount of conditioning can fully reach, that a sound this large and this wrong means that the world is ending. The horse nearest the first detonation reared straight up. Its rider, a veteran of 3 campaigns, a man who had stayed mounted through conditions that would have unseated a lesser horseman, went sideways. He caught himself on the reins, and the reins pulled the animal's head down, and the animal, now fully panicked, drove forward into the horse ahead of it. That horse shied left. The horse to its left had nowhere to go. The valley wall was 8 meters away and closing, and it shied right into the horse that had caused the collision, and the collision spread outward through the packed mass the way a crack spreads through ice, each impact creating the next one, the geometry of catastrophe moving faster than any order could travel in the other direction. The second detonation found a different section of the column. The third found another. Inside the smoke and the noise and the cascading panic of the horses, the Mongol formation did something it had not done in 70 years of continuous warfare. It stopped being a formation. Not because the men were broken. The men were not broken. These were trained soldiers, professionals, survivors of campaigns that had demanded everything a human being can give and then demanded more. Individual Mongol warriors were still fighting, still trying to impose order on the animals beneath them, still looking for the command structure that would tell them what to do next. Chagan was shouting, other commanders were shouting, the orders were real, and they were given by men who knew what they were doing. But an order requires a receiver, and the receiver was a horse, and the horse was no longer listening to anything except the sound that the limestone walls kept returning, louder each time, from every direction at once. A horse that will not respond is not a cavalry unit. It is a large, frightened animal in an enclosed space, and large, frightened animals in enclosed spaces make their own decisions. They turned against their riders. They drove into their neighbors. Several bolted directly backward through the rear of the column, crashing through the units still pressing forward from the valley mouth, converting the compression at the rear into a different kind of chaos. One horse went down entirely, throwing its rider hard onto the limestone floor, and the horses around it shied from the falling weight and created a gap in the formation that other horses moved into without instruction, and the gap was in the wrong place, and it made everything worse. The smoke thickened. The irregular detonations continued. Not constant, not overwhelming, but unpredictable, which was worse than constant, because unpredictable cannot be adapted to. Each new firing reset the panic in the horses that had begun to settle from the last one. The valley held all of it, the sound and the smoke and the smell, and gave none of it back. The Mongol military machine had been built on the premise that the horse and the rider were one instrument. That premise required the horse. The horse was gone. What remained in the valley, in the smoke, in the compressed and disordered mass of 10,000 men who had ridden in expecting to finish something quickly, was a cavalry force without its cavalry. Armed men on foot in a narrow place with enemies pressing in from 3 directions and a sound they had never heard before still arriving from the ridgelines above them, irregular and total and entirely without mercy. The formation was broken from the inside.
The prison had become a furnace. But furnaces, if the pressure finds a crack, can still explode outward. Kitbuka found the crack. It was not genius, it was desperation wearing the shape of instinct. A commander reading a collapsing situation and identifying the one place where the encirclement was thinnest, where the descent from the western ridgeline had stretched the Mamluk line across too much ground, where the horses were tired and the men had been fighting for 20 minutes, and the formation had the specific thinness of something that has given everything it has and is running on the residue of discipline rather than the substance of it. The Mongol right wing, everything that remained of it, concentrated, driven hard, aimed at the Mamluk left with the focused violence of an army that has stopped trying to win and started trying to exist. The impact was immediate and devastating. The Mamluk left flank have been pressing inward through the encirclement for 20 minutes in the specific grinding way that close-quarters cavalry combat works. Forward, back, forward, the line holding through accumulated individual decisions to hold. When the Mongol right wing hit it, those decisions stopped being enough. Horses went down, gaps opened. The men filling the gaps were already tired, and tired men fill gaps slowly, and slowly is the difference between a line that holds and a line that doesn't. The Mamluk left flank began to come apart. Not collapse, not rout, the specific dangerous middle state between holding and breaking, where the outcome depends entirely on what the next 30 seconds produce. Men were pulling back,
The pulling back created space. The space invited more pulling back. The mathematics of retreat is self-reinforcing, and the Mamluk left flank of the Ain Salai army was doing the mathematics. Then the helmet hit the ground.
Qutuz tore it from his head and threw it, not dropped, thrown, with force and intention, the deliberate act of a man converting a piece of equipment into a message. The helmet struck the valley floor, and the men nearest him saw it and understood what it meant before they understood why they understood it. He turned his horse toward the collapsing left. Wa Islama, not a battle order, not a tactical instruction, two words that bypassed the calculating part of the mind and struck something older and deeper, the part that knows, without reasoning toward it, what it means when the man responsible for everything rides toward the worst place without protection on his head. The nearest soldiers stopped pulling back. They turned, not all at once, not cleanly, but the turning spread the way the retreat had spread, man to man, the sight of each turning soldier making the decision easier for the one beside him, the momentum reversing itself in the space of seconds. A sultan with a bare head riding into the worst point of the battle is not a tactical argument. It is an answer to a question that no one had spoken aloud. Are we leaving him? The Mamluk left reformed around Qutuz like iron filings around a magnet. The men who had been calculating the distance to safety were now calculating something else entirely. The Mongol right wing hit the reformed line, and the reformed line held. The crack had closed. But underneath the valley floor, something had been opening for hours. It had begun quietly, the way the most decisive things begin, without announcement, without drama, in the accumulation of small physical facts that no single moment made visible. The spring water of Ain Jalut had been seeping through fractured limestone for centuries. It did not hurry, it did not need to. It simply moved downward, the way water moves, finding the spaces between rock and filling them, softening what it touched, turning the valley floor into something that looked like ground and behaved, under sufficient weight, like something else entirely. Sufficient weight had arrived. 10,000 horses. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A Mongol war horse weighed 300 kilograms. Its rider, in armor, added another 80. The combined weight of horse and man pressing down on a single point of ground was nearly 400 kilograms. Multiply that by 10,000. Distribute it across a valley floor that had been receiving that weight for 2 hours of compressed, churning, directionally confused combat. Watch what the surface does. It gave. Not everywhere, not all at once, in patches. In the places where the spring water had done its patient work most thoroughly, the limestone surface cracked under the accumulated pressure, and the soil beneath it, soft, wet, dark, came to the surface. The first horses to find those patches did not understand what was happening. A Mongol war horse trained on the yielding grass of the Central Asian steppe had no instinct for this. The ground had always held. The ground was supposed to hold. The ground did not hold. A horse sinking into unexpected softness panics in a specific way. It does not sink gracefully. It lurches, drives its hooves deeper trying to find purchase, compounds the problem with every effort to solve it. The horse beside it shies from the movement. The shying creates its own collision. The collision spreads. And the limestone. The patches where the rock surfaced were worse in a different way, not soft, but mercilessly hard, with edges that the steppe had never produced. The Mongol horses were unshod. This was not negligence. On the yielding grass of their homeland it was not necessary, and the unshod hoof developed a sensitivity that served the animal well on soft ground. On exposed limestone with sharp fractured edges, that same sensitivity became a liability. Each stride on bare rock cost something. The costs accumulated. A horse that begins to favor one leg slows. A horse that slows in a compressed valley with enemies pressing from 3 directions is no longer a cavalry unit. It is a target. The Mamluk horse warriors were shod, iron shoes, distributing force, gripping stone. They moved where the Mongol horses could not. They pressed into the gaps that the terrain was opening, not through superior courage or superior numbers, but through the simple advantage of feet that the ground could not defeat. The steppes' greatest gift had always been speed. The valley had taken it.
What remained now was the ending, and endings, when they come to things that believed themselves permanent, are not quick. Kitbuka was still fighting. This is the detail that the chronicles preserve, and it matters. His army was gone, not retreating, not regrouping, gone, dissolved into the smoke and mud and compressed chaos of a valley that had been built specifically to dissolve it. The formation that had carried Mongol power from the Pacific to the edge of Europe had ceased to exist as a military fact. Individual men were still standing, still swinging weapons, still doing what soldiers do when the larger structure has failed them, and all that remains is the immediate body and the immediate threat. Kitbuka was among them. He had stopped giving orders. There were no units left to receive them. He fought the way a man fights when fighting is the only remaining decision available to him, forward into the worst of it, without calculation, without the commander's habit of preserving himself for the next engagement. There would be no next engagement. He knew that. He had known it, perhaps, since the moment he looked at the western ridgeline and watched it move. His horse was struck and went down. He rose. He continued. When the Mamluk soldiers took him, he did not resist, not from surrender, from the specific exhaustion of a man who has given everything the body contains and found it insufficient. He was brought before Sultan Qutuz, still bareheaded, the valley floor behind them littered with the evidence of what the morning had produced. The execution was immediate. When the commander fell, the last coherence fell with him. What remained of the Mongol force stopped being an army and became individuals. And individuals in a valley with walls on every side and enemies in every direction have only one remaining instinct. They ran.
Baybars had anticipated this. The pursuit forces he had held in reserve, fresh horses, riders who had not been spent in the encirclement, moved out of the valley mouth before the last organized resistance inside had finished collapsing. They spread across the surrounding hills in coordinated groups, covering the escape routes with the same systematic intelligence that had built the trap in the first place. The hills that had hidden the Mamluk army that morning now funneled the fleeing Mongols toward waiting blades. By evening, the surrounding terrain was quiet. Not one man carried the story out. The storm had not been turned back, it had been swallowed. The Mongol expansion that had consumed cities and caliphates and armies for 70 years had found its final coordinate, not at a great fortress, not at the edge of a sea, but in a narrow corridor of limestone and spring water where two men had looked at an invincible enemy and given it not a battlefield but a prison. The swamp had done what the swamp was built to do. It did not return what it swallowed.